The Queen is dead. The country watches as her coffin retreats, her face never to be glimpsed again. Her eldest, Charles, watches his mother leave him one last time. He turns. He walks. Away from prying eyes he finds respite, and only now does it truly hit him. His mother is dead, and he is king.
At last.
King Charles III is a 2014 stage play written by Mike Bartlett, eventually adapted by the BBC into a 2017 television film, with most of the cast from the play reprising their original roles. The film is set in the near future after the Queen's death, and depicts the short but explosive reign of Charles III, then just Charles, Prince of Wales, who comes into conflict with his own government and parliament, threatening centuries of careful tradition as he forces people to ask, who really has the power in this system, and should those that have it use it? Just so everyone is on the same page, I'll give an overview of the British political system. If you're already familiar, or just don't care, then you can skip ahead to the next chapter, but I think it's important we really establish the specifics on how the British monarchy functions, as the film's very premise hinges on those specificities. The United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland is what is known as a constitutional monarchy, a system where the monarch's power is constrained by some sort of constitution, written or otherwise.
This is in contrast with absolute monarchies like Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, or Vatican City, where the ruler's power is completely unconstrained and their word is law.
Bear in mind, a constitutional monarchy doesn't always mean a powerless monarch. Countries like Jordan and Liechtenstein are constitutional monarchies, where their respective crowns wield substantial power and influence. But in most cases, such as most European monarchies as well as places like Japan, the monarch is a largely ceremonial head of state, with most actual power lying with the head of government, their cabinet and the legislature. Such is the way of parliamentary democracy. However, it is not uncommon for the monarch to, legally, retain some very substantial powers, as is the case in the United Kingdom. Things such as appointing the Prime Minister, declaring war, dissolving Parliament, and signing bills into law. Royal prerogative. Nowadays, these things are only done on the advice of cabinet, but what's actually stopping King Charles from, say, picking a Prime Minister he likes and declaring war on Germany again? Well, other than common sense, a little thing known as convention. In other words, because that's just how it is. The monarch is obliged to pick the person most likely to command the confidence of the House of Commons, ergo the leader of the largest party/coalition, as Prime Minister. But they don't have to. If they wanted, they could just sack the old PM and ask some other random asshole to form the government. It hasn't happened since 1834, but it could. The only thing stopping it is that oh so important convention, and if that were to be disregarded, it might trigger a collapse in the system itself. Over the centuries, Parliament and Crown have established a status quo, one where the former ultimately holds supremacy. But to this day, those reserve powers remain, and though tradition is a powerful thing, it only takes one person, in the right place, at the right time, to realize that a game only works if everyone chooses to play it.
The throne is barely warm before King Charles encounters his first challenge. A bill that would curtail the power of the press, ostensibly to stop them from publicising damaging rumours and lies. The bill has been passed by the Commons, it's gone through the House of Lords, all it needs is Charles's signature, which is really just a formality. The bill is essentially law already. This is just a tradition, a convention, one that nobody has any reason to break, right? Despite his poor experiences with the infamously schlocky British tabloids, Charles is concerned it would restrict the freedom of the press too much. Thus, he cannot sign the bill in its current form in good conscience. The Prime Minister presses him, but this runs deeper than just a disagreement. Charles fears that if he willingly gives his assent to something he does not agree with, he ceases to become King Charles and will instead be the king. Not a person with views and ideas, just a cog turning automatically, keeping the larger system going without deviation.
Think about it. Did you feel the need to specify it was Queen Elizabeth II you were talking about? No, because she wasn't Elizabeth. She was the Queen.
But I know you're acting out of conscience.
That's right, and in good conscience I have thought that come the moment, surely I could sign. But when the pen approaches paper thus, about to store forever my assent, the pen dries up. My hand, it cannot write. For if my name is given through routine, and not because it represents my view, then soon I'll have no name. And nameless, I have not myself.
Despite this, Prime Minister Evans does his best to convince Charles, emphasizing that his mother must have had bills fly across her desk that she absolutely disagreed with, sent by governments she reviled, but still she signed, because she knew it was the elected who made the law, and to overrule them would be a gross affront to the very notion of democracy.
She oversaw the alteration from the unions, mines and factories that stood for generations, to a world that Thatcherated, Reaganized. They placed the profit higher value than the pride belonging to the man who travels day by day upon the Clapham omnibus. And through all this, when laws arrived from those prime ministers she hated, doing things of which I'm sure she never would approve, she still did sign. Respected all the votes, empowering those elect to make the law. She always signed. She always gave assent.
Well, I cannot.
Despite numerous meetings, Charles and Evans are unable to resolve the issue of the bill, forcing their conflict into the public and openly bringing the king into politics. The people are split almost 50-50 in terms of support for Charles's decision, which is actually far more than he expected, which bolsters his confidence, seeing this as proof of the deep, irrefutable bond between crown and country. However, Evans and his government intend to press on, with plans to pass a law allowing Parliament to bypass royal assent. As the deadlock continues, Charles sees a vision of his late wife, Diana, who promises that he shall be the greatest king of all. This follows a meeting with Mrs. Stevens, the leader of the opposition, who suggests that he looks to his ancestor, William IV, who, when confronted with the opposite problem of a bill he wanted passed getting held up in Parliament, pursued an unorthodox solution.
The cabinet drew up a formal minute advising the king to dissolve Parliament. On April 21, 1831, the king wrote to his prime minister gloomily accepting dissolution as the lesser of two evils. Events now began to move with violent speed. Lord Warncliffe announced his intention of sponsoring in the House of Lords a motion against dissolving Parliament. The king flared up at what seemed to him dangerous interference with his exercise of the prerogative. He was indeed so eager to act that he did no more than express mild surprise when Brougham, Lord High Chancellor, admitted that he had already ordered an escort of the Horse Guards to be in attendance. In a vivid phrase, George Villiers described the scene as William settled himself upon the throne, with the tall grim figure of Lord Grey, Prime Minister, beside him, sword of state in hand.
It was as if the king had got his executioner by his side, and the whole picture looked strikingly typical of his and our future destinies.
Also, because I don't know if I'll ever get the chance to say this again, apparently while this was going on, the Marquis of Londonderry was going around threatening people with a whip and had to be held back by 4 or 5 of his colleagues. Yeah, in case you ever thought politics now was mad.
Just before the vote can be held, Charles storms into the House of Commons and, with the reluctant support of the Speaker, dissolves Parliament, triggering new elections. As the House descends into chaos, Charles admonishes their behaviour, accusing them of having lost the trust of the people through their politicking. He goes on, not only claiming it was they who forced his hand in this matter, but that he has a stronger mandate than any of them.
Unlike you all, I'm born and raised to rule. I do not choose. But like an Albion oak, I'm sown in British soil and grown, not for myself, but reared with single purpose meant, whilst you have small constituency support, which gusts and falls as does the wind. My cells and organs constitute this land.
This, of course, sparks mass protests and violence across the country, with London seeing the worst of it. Seeing this threat to his authority and unwilling to back down this far into the game, Charles reacts by turning on the people he claims to have such an intrinsic bond to, stationing the army outside of Buckingham Palace and even pointing a tank at the crowds. As the chaos continues, Prince William has his own vision of Diana, promising him that he will be the greatest king of all. This, combined with some very not subtle manipulation from Lady Macmiddleton, encourages him to confront his father. At a press conference supposedly for Charles, he steals the podium and proclaims that he, as Prince of Wales, will act as mediator between King and Parliament. Hurt and alone, Charles retreats to the palace, but is confronted by William, who admonishes his performance as king, as son, as father, and as husband, demanding he willingly abdicate in favour of his popular children, his planned coronation turning into William and Kate's. Charles resists. Even when confronted by Evans, Kate, and Harry, he refuses to abandon his life's calling, until his children threaten to leave, taking their children with them. Faced with the prospect of spending the rest of his life alone, Charles reluctantly, finally, concedes, signing the document confirming his abdication. Later, at William and Kate's coronation, Charles takes the crown, places it on his son's head, and storms off, though not before uttering a resentful, "God save you."
God save the king!
As someone who prefers to avoid thinking about the royals at all costs, but has a vested interest in politics, King Charles III appeals to me because it focuses on the royal family not as cultural symbols, but as a political institution.
The film examines the existential conundrum of constitutional monarchy, of being ostensibly a democracy whilst still having a hereditary head of state.
And it's one thing for that monarch to be a blatant figurehead that's purely there for cultural reasons, but it's another entirely to continue to hold them up as the central pillar to a country's entire being, to continue to, even superficially, involve them in the workings and systems of government. King Charles III is about that very paradox of what happens when you treat royalty as both God's chosen temporal ruler, but also a recently hired civil servant whose job it is to make sure people don't get lost around the office. The result is someone who thinks they're the hottest shit on the block, who is predestined for greatness, but is being wrongly held back, denied power that is rightly theirs.
After all, what's holding Charles back aren't limits on his power. As king, he is legally within his right to withhold assent and dissolve Parliament. Rather, it's convention, or, in other words, everyone else's expectations of how he should act. How Elizabeth acted. Her long, largely inoffensive reign blinded people to the legal reality of the British monarch. And, ironically, Charles is the only one seeing the wood for the trees. He alone asks the question, what is the point of my power if I cannot use it?
To some, the answer is just in case. Hopefully, the monarch is never called to use their few reserve powers, but in the event of, say, a fascist government or military coup, they would be able to instantly step in and restore peace. If a government tried to act with blatantly self-serving and anti-democratic intent, then the king or queen of the day would put their foot down and stand up for the good of the country.
On the 28th of August 2019, Boris Johnson, who at that point had been Prime Minister for about a month, advised the Queen to prorogue Parliament.
Prorogation is the period between the end of a parliamentary session and the beginning of a new one, which is marked with the state opening of Parliament. This was wildly seen as a way for Johnson to avoid parliamentary scrutiny of his Brexit plans, not just by opposition leaders in Parliament, but by then Speaker of the House John Bercow, former Prime Minister John Major, legal scholars, and, soon enough, the courts, who ruled that the prorogation was unlawful and Parliament resumed the very next day. Of course, the whole thing could have been avoided very easily if her Madge had just said no. She had to have known it was unlawful, and if she couldn't figure it out herself, then the entire country saying so probably would have tipped her off. But she didn't do anything. She couldn't. She couldn't say no to any Prime Minister, even one as blatantly corrupt and incompetent as Boris Johnson, because he was the one who commanded the confidence of the Commons, the elected representatives of the people. Ignoring the fact that we use an undemocratic first-past-the-post system and Parliament doesn't reflect the actual vote, but that's something for another day. I could point to the numerous other atrocities that Johnson's government did in the name of the Queen, but King Charles, the real King Charles, has done me the kindness of already getting himself into a sticky situation.
Once a Prime Minister resigns, they are generally allowed to nominate several people to the monarch to become peers to join the House of Lords, in what is known as a resignation honours list.
In other words, it's so they can reward their most loyal fart smellers.
Boris Johnson's list noticeably contains 4 still-sitting Tory MPs, all of whom have agreed to defer their current peerages until the end of the current Parliament, as opposed to resigning as MPs immediately, as is customary.
This alone is unprecedented. It technically means you have people sitting in both houses of Parliament at the same time, but the real kicker is the motive. The reason these MPs are being asked to delay their peerages is in order to avoid triggering by-elections in their seats, and you only have to take a glance at current polling to know they would be embarrassing losses. This is a blatantly partisan move that Rishi Sunak, assuming he's still Prime Minister when I put this out, would need the king to agree to, thus bringing the monarch into party politics. To be fair to Charles, there would have been controversy regardless of whether or not he accepted. In fact, just going along with it was probably the safer option. What I'm getting at is that our monarch, despite supposedly being this all-important safeguard for the integrity of government, ultimately isn't that. In fact, they're not really much of anything. There might exist rare circumstances where a monarch might be able to act. If Rishi suddenly developed late-onset schizophrenia and demanded war with the US, I'm pretty sure Charles would have no problem saying no. And a monarch as old and respected as the late Elizabeth might have been afforded a little wiggle room when it came to nudging a prime minister in a direction they preferred. But if they, in the face of clear democratic backsliding, can't even say no, then what's the point in having them? Charles's final monologue in the film addresses this, as the now former king despairs not just his own future, but the future of the monarchy.
Whilst far away, the king and queen do rule over a golden age of monarchy that bothers no one, does no good, and is a pretty plastic picture with no meaning.
So, was he in the right then? Should the monarch be more involved in politics? I don't think the film is saying that. The initial bill was probably a controversial one, but Charles's intervention only escalated the situation, even if he did have good intentions. He is a king who overrules the most prominent elected official in the country, and when Parliament, the true sovereign, attempts to curtail him, he dissolves it in order to preserve his power, which, along with his subsequent actions, really dispels the idea that he's doing this entirely for selfless reasons. In Parliament, he rants about how he was born to rule, how his birth and upbringing make him and him alone equipped to lead the country. When the public turns on him, he takes command of the military and points a bloody tank at them. He proclaims to William that he will be the greatest king of all, even as the nation falls apart around him. Charles thinks what he's doing is for the greater good, but it's arrogance and entitlement, not altruism, that pushes him, especially in the latter half of the story. The film is none too flattering towards other members of the royal family as well. Camilla is a two-dimensional sycophant who only does her best to enable Charles's entitled mania. William is an absolute wimp who can't make a decision to save his life and is only doing what his wife tells him to do. And speaking of, I wasn't joking when I compared Kate to Lady Macbeth. Kate is a ruthless social climber who orchestrates against Charles solely in the name of her self-interest. The point is, these people aren't equipped to truly rule, and although the status quo is restored at the end of the film, it's been exposed for how truly fragile it is. As a result, it ends on a rather uncertain note, leaving real Brits with no real answer as to the ideal form our monarchy should take.
Of course, there's one outcome that I haven't mentioned up until now. We replace the monarch with an elected head of state. After all, the main thing stopping royalty from doing anything is that lack of a democratic mandate.
It's the same reason the House of Lords has seen its power diminish in the last century. It isn't elected, and thus has no right to supersede the Commons.
However, if the head of state has their own democratic mandate, then all these problems go away. They wouldn't be stepping over a people's representative because they themselves would be representative of the people. They would have the authority to stand up to the government.
It certainly would have made Charles's refusal to sign the bill in the film far less controversial. Prime Minister Evans admits it wouldn't be nearly as big of a deal if the king was a president.
And we don't even have to go full presidential. Most European countries are parliamentary republics, with a president who, like the British monarch, can only use their powers on the advice of the government, but is allowed to use their remaining discretionary powers and take a more active role in politics, because they also have a mandate. Take the President of Ireland, just next door. They have the ability to refer a bill to the Supreme Court to assess its constitutionality. If we had an equivalent here in the UK, it's possible things like the prorogation of Parliament might have never happened. I think by now it should be obvious what my personal thoughts on the British monarchy are. I could probably dedicate an entire section to other reasons why I think they shouldn't exist. But until a few months ago, I was generally fine with letting them be. If there was a referendum, I would have voted to get rid of them, but it wasn't something I was really concerned about. Not when this country has so many more pressing issues that need resolving now. But then the Queen died, and when someone holds a post for that long, there's a tendency to think of the person and the institution as the same thing. Her death reminded me to look at the monarchy for the institution it is, which naturally made me want to revisit this film. A film about a well-meaning narcissist, a selfish, power-hungry Shakespeare protagonist in the making, and the wettest, dampest, most pathetic blanket in existence, all struggling in their own way to justify the continuation of an establishment that, perhaps, lost its meaning long ago. I don't see the royal family going anywhere anytime soon. Other Commonwealth realms like Jamaica, Australia, St. Lucia might ditch them, but I think the British, or at least the English, will keep them around for a while. But even so, I think now more than ever, as we step into a new reign, as we watch the crown pass from one head to another, we need to remind ourselves that the monarchy isn't just the face on our money, or something you sing about at a football match, or an excuse to get off work when one of them gets married. It's a political institution, and like all others, we should always be questioning it, questioning how it benefits us. And if it doesn't, why it's still here. It's been a while since my last big video. I moved back to university and have been busy with that, which is why things have been a little quiet around here. Now that I've adjusted a little bit, I'm hoping I should be able to get back to a more consistent schedule. If all goes well, I should have one more video out before the end of this year. If you don't want to miss that, then like, comment, subscribe, you know, all the stuff. And of course, check out my Patreon, where you get stuff like early access to second channel videos and music, director's commentaries, credits and videos, and general behind the scenes stuff. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you soon. Bye bye.